October 29th, 1929. Black Tuesday. The stock market dropped by 12% in a single day. Fortunes vanished in hours. Banks collapsed in waves, and businesses shut down. By 1933, 25% of Americans had no job. The government threw everything at the problem, launching public works and relief programs on a scale the country had never really seen before. But 10 years after the crash, unemployment was still hanging around 15%. Families who once owned homes were surviving in cardboard shacks and dirt camps, right in the shadows of the wealthy skyline. Then, overnight, the entire economy shifted. The United States entered World War II, and factories that had been gathering dust roared back to life. Instead of tractors and cars, they were building tanks and bombers. Defense spending rocketed from 1.4% of GDP to over 37%. Suddenly, 17 million new jobs appeared, and unemployment dropped below 2%. On paper, the turnaround looked incredible. Keynesian economists observed this shift and concluded that when people stop spending, the government can simply spend for them to cure a depression. They declared the case closed. Government spending had saved the American economy. But the numbers on paper ignored the reality in the kitchen. By 1944, Americans were living under some of the strictest rationing in U.S. history. As these government-issued stamps show, everyday items like sugar, coffee, meat, and cheese were heavily restricted. Car production had been banned entirely. You could have a steady paycheck from the tank plant, but your family was eating less than when you were broke. This is the trick of the wartime boom. When a family builds a house for $10 million, the national GDP goes up by $10 million. When the government builds a bomb for $10 million and drops it into the sea, GDP increases by the same amount. One results in a home, the other a statistic. The booming GDP was an illusion. The true test came in 1945. The war ended, and 10 million soldiers were about to flood the job market. Government spending was scheduled to drop by over 60%. Nobel-winning economists and President Truman himself predicted that without that government money, America faced the greatest period of unemployment in its history. They were wrong. Unemployment peaked at just 3.9%. The economy didn't just survive the spending cuts, it thrived because of them. Once resources were released from the war machine, bomb factories became appliance factories, and shipyards pivoted to fishing vessels, making things people actually wanted. To find the root of the damage, we have to look at 1914. World War I required building battleships and artillery on a scale the world had never seen. Governments ran out of tax revenue and physical gold to fund the conflict, so they ditched the gold standard and started printing paper money. This triggered a cycle of competitive devaluation. After the war, countries kept printing to make their money cheaper so their exports would look more attractive to neighbors. France devalued, then Britain devalued to undercut France, creating a global race to the bottom that destroyed the value of everyone's money. The result was total instability. In Berlin, a loaf of bread eventually cost 200 billion marks, requiring a wheelbarrow of cash just to buy groceries. With money nobody trusted, world trade collapsed by 66% between 1929 and 1934. This economic humiliation wiped out the middle class and convinced millions that the existing system was broken. In their desperation for stability, citizens became interested in any man on a podium promising a fix. Germany chose Hitler, and Italy chose Mussolini. History shows that when a government destroys the integrity of its money to fund its deficits, it destroys the foundation of its society. Economic chaos provided the vacuum that totalitarian leaders filled, turning the printing press into a precursor for the battlefield. In 1944, delegates from 44 nations gathered at a hotel in New Hampshire to engineer a system that prevented this cycle of devaluation. Their goal was to build a boring but essential foundation for the post-war world. Their solution was a double bag. Every global currency was tied to the US dollar, and the US dollar was tied to physical gold at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce. This mechanism created a hard limit. A government couldn't simply print its way out of a deficit because there was a physical stop in the vault. If you didn't have the gold, you couldn't print the money. This stability allowed Reconstruction to actually take root. While aid programs provided capital, it was the anchor of stable money that allowed a machinist in Germany or Japan to take out a loan and rebuild his shop, knowing the currency he earned wouldn't evaporate into inflation by the time he paid it back. Germany, Japan, and France boomed. This miracle wasn't driven by continuous government stimulus, but by the boring foundation of money that politicians couldn't casually print. The system had one fatal flaw. It relied entirely on the United States to restrain its own spending. If France printed too many francs, the peg would break and the markets would punish them. But because the dollar was the anchor for everyone else, America could spend money it didn't have. In the 1960s, President Lyndon Johnson tried to fund both a war in Vietnam and an expansive welfare state at home simultaneously. To pay the bills, the U.S. flooded the world with newly printed paper dollars. The gold in Fort Knox stayed the same, but the number of dollars claiming that gold multiplied. America was effectively exporting its inflation to every other country tied to the dollar. French President Charles de Gaulle realized that holding these dollars was a losing game. In 1965, he sent ships to America to withdraw France's gold, famously stating that printing more dollars without gold was robbery with better tailoring. France's demand exposed the truth. There wasn't enough gold to go around. This sparked a full-blown run on the American gold vault, as other nations realized the anchor was dragging. By 1966, the math was impossible. The U.S. had just $3.2 billion in gold to cover $14 billion in foreign claims. Under the rules of the system it had created, the United States was bankrupt. On August 15, 1971, President Nixon gathered his advisors at Camp David and made the decision to suspend the convertibility of dollars into gold. The golden anchor was gone, replaced by nothing but a government's promise. The fallout was immediate. Gold, once fixed at $35, began a climb toward thousands of dollars. Within 2 years, the oil crisis hit. Inflation surged, and Americans found themselves waiting in block-long lines for gasoline. Economists had to invent a new word for this stalled growth and rising prices: stagflation. Since that anchor was severed, a pattern has emerged. From the savings and loan crisis of the 70s to the dot-com bust and the 2008 financial collapse, the response to systemic instability has repeatedly fallen back on printing more money, justifying the move with the same myth that wartime spending creates prosperity. But history shows that true stability is impossible without an anchored currency. The illusion that government spending is a cure for debt remains the most dangerous lie in economics.